Judges. We'll be reading from chapter 16. Going to start off with verses 4 through 22, or 4 through 15, rather. 4 through 10, let's try that again. And then I will narrate a little bit for you what happens after that, and then we'll pick the scripture reading back up starting at verse 15. This morning we're going to talk about toxic relationships and look at that through the lens of Samson and Delilah. So let us listen for God's word. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "See if you can lure him into showing you the secret of his great strength, and how we can overpower him so we may tie him up and subdue him. Each one of us will give you 1,100 shekels of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Tell me the secret of your great strength and how you can be tied up and subdued." Samson answered her, "If anyone ties me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been tied, I'll become as weak as any other man." Then the rulers of the Philistines brought her 7 fresh bowstrings that had not been dried, and she tied him up with them. With men hidden in the room, she called to him, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." But he snapped the bowstrings as easily as a piece of string snaps when it comes close to a flame. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Then Delilah said to Samson, "You have made a fool of me. You lied to me. Come now, tell me how you can be tied." This progression of events continues to unfold. Delilah continues to ask Samson how it is that he can be tied up, and he lies to her a second time, and he tells her that new rope is what can tie him up. But when she ties him up, he is able to break free from his captivity. So she's made a fool of again. Samson lies to her a third time and tells her that if she only ties the braids of his hair into the loom, then he can be subdued. But as Delilah finds out, he has lied again, and he's able to break free from that loom. And so Delilah says to him, "How can you say I love you when you won't confide in me? This is the third time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite, dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, "Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, Delilah called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him. And Samson's strength left him. Then she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as I did before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Amen. So as I said this morning, we're going to talk about toxic relationships, but I want to begin by defining what we are not talking about. We are not talking about difficult relationships this morning. So as we go through the sermon, as I'm speaking about this topic, I want you to understand very clearly And I'm not talking about difficult relationships, because we all have them in our lives. We sometimes have difficult friendships. We have difficult relationships with coworkers. Some of us may have difficult marriages. There are often times when one spouse is carrying a heavier burden or load than the other. And that can be a difficult marriage. But that is not what we're talking about this morning. And so I just want to make that very clear up front. What we are talking about today are toxic relationships. Relationships that will suck the life out of you. Relationships that have the potential to sever the power of God that is within you. We have a very toxic relationship this morning in Samson and Delilah. But to really grasp just how toxic this relationship is, it helps to understand exactly who Samson is. We are told that he is a Nazirite, and that has some very significant implications for his life. His mother promised that he would be a Nazirite from the time that he was in her womb. And so from the very first days of his life, Samson had to live this life that was one of complete devotion to God. When you take a Nazirite vow, you're making some very significant promises to God about how you're going to live your life. The first part of that Nazirite vow, and you can find this in Numbers chapter 6. The first part of the vow is that the Nazirite will not drink anything that is wine or fermented. They will not eat anything that comes from the vine. And so the Nazirite cannot consume alcohol. The second component of a Nazirite vow is that you are not to touch anything that is unclean. And this would certainly include dead bodies. This vow is so strict that even if your close relative dies in your presence, you cannot reach out and touch them. The third part of the Nazirite vow, and this is probably what we're most familiar with when we think of the story of Samson and Delilah, is that the Nazirite may not cut their hair. No razor can be taken to the head, because it is a sign of the power of God that is within that individual. So when we look at Samson and Delilah this morning, I guess the first question is, who's at fault? Who's at fault? Why does this relationship get to the place where it does? I think the first thing I want to say this morning is we're going to talk about Samson's mistakes, but we're also not going to blame the victim here, because Samson is in this toxic relationship with Delilah. Samson makes some mistakes along the way, some significant mistakes, but at the end of the day, it is Delilah who is the one that is toxic. But as is the case for so many of us, sometimes we make a series of mistakes in life that lead us to these places where we get this toxic relationship. If you go back to Judges chapter 14, you get the account of Samson's marriage. He goes out and wants to marry a Philistine woman, much to the objection of his parents. Along the way into meet his bride, Samson is attacked by a lion. And he defeats this lion. He rips it apart and leaves the lion for dead. Remember, the Nazirite is not supposed to touch dead bodies. But he leaves this lion carcass and he goes in to meet his bride. And they have what is called a wedding feast, as was customary for the young men. It means they ate, they drank, and were merry. A Nazirite cannot consume anything from the vine. So again, Samson is slowly but surely violating this vow, this Nazirite vow that he has made with God. He's making a series of mistakes, and it gets progressively worse. His first wife is killed by the Philistines, and Samson becomes enraged. And so he takes the jawbone of a donkey, and he goes out and he kills 1,000 Philistine men. The mistakes are getting progressively worse. He continues to violate this vow that he has made to God, save for one part. Samson hasn't cut his hair. He still has this power of God dwelling inside him. And then he meets Delilah. So let's talk about Delilah. She's motivated by money. See, Samson is the last judge, the last ruler as a judge that the Israelites will have. He is ruling over them. At this time in the history of Israel, when the Philistines have actually kind of conquered the Israelites. And so the Philistines want to do anything they can to take him down. So they go up to Delilah and they offer her money. They say, we'll give you 1,100 shekels of silver. 1,100 shekels for each leader. We will give you if you can figure out how to tie this guy up and subdue him. Now, Judges chapter 3 says that there were 5 leaders of the Philistines. So that's 5,500 shekels of silver. She is being tempted with this vast amount of money. The average wages for a year for a day laborer are 10 shekels. They are promising her 550 times a year salary if she can figure out how to subdue Samson. And so they get into this kind of cyclical routine of lying to one another, this deception. Also, Delilah can make this money. She's using Samson. And so they get into this back and forth that really looks ridiculous if you think about it. She literally tells him, I need to know what I can do to tie you up and subdue you. And he goes along with it. Why? Why in the world would anyone do this? Sometime later, Samson fell in love. He fell in love with a woman in the Valley of Sorek whose name was Delilah. Samson told Delilah that he loved her. Samson loved Delilah. He's made these series of mistakes in his life. But he had a love and a passion for Delilah. And she never said it back. Delilah never reciprocated the love. And so Samson, in love with this woman, continues to make these violations of this vow he's made to God. He tells her that he can be tied up by bowstrings. That doesn't work. He tells her that she can be tied up with new rope. That doesn't work. He tells her that his hair, if it's woven into the loom, can subdue him. He is tiptoeing closer and closer to breaking that sacred vow that has the power of God within him. Until finally, he tells her his secret. If the hair on his head is cut, he can be subdued. Have you ever had a toxic relationship? A relationship that brings you to the point of death. Toxic relationships leave scars in our lives. They will suck the light out of you. They have the potential to sever the power of God that it dwells within you. I had a toxic relationship in my life. It wasn't romantic, but it was a friendship in my late teens and early 20s. This was a friendship with someone who I looked up to, who should have been a mentor to me. And instead, kind of led me to make some poor choices in my life. Toxic relationships suck the life out of you. The impact of the toxic relationship, whether you're in one right now or whether it's from some years ago, the impact of that lasts sometimes for a lifetime. Samson's eyes were gouged out. You can't get those things back. With toxic relationships, you can't undo the things that were done. You can't unsay the things that were said. You can't redo the poor choices that were made that led up to that point in your life. So what are we to do? I once read a story. There was a dad who was walking through the airport with his 2 young children. And as they were making their way through the airport, the youngest child said to the dad, "I need to go to the bathroom." So the dad took his child into the bathroom, and the child goes into the stall. The dad puts the child in the stall so he can do his business. When the child had finished, he began to cry. Daddy, I cannot get rid of this mess that is in front of me. There's no handle for me to flush it." The dad said to his child, "It's an automatic toilet. Sometimes you got to get up, turn around, and walk away." Hear that? Sometimes when you get in these toxic relationships of life, there's literally this mess in front of you. What are you supposed to do? With toxic relationships, those things that will suck the life out of you, suck the power of God out of your life, you have to get up, turn around, and walk away. Samson walked away. Yeah, his eyes were gouged out. Yeah, he was put into prison where he starts grinding grain. But you know what he doesn't do? He doesn't start texting Delilah saying, "Hey, baby, I need you back." He doesn't start trolling her on Facebook or Instagram or what have you, trying to figure out what it is Delilah's doing in her newfound free time. Samson doesn't even think about her anymore. Samson has got up, turned around, and walked away. I was at Men's Alliance on Monday night, and they began to recite the creed. And there were 4 parts of the creed that, man, it just hit home with me this week. It hit home. It's as if it was written for the story of Samson. My past failures do not define me. When the world knocks me down, I will get back up every time. Faithfulness to family and devotion to God will be my legacy. And I will finish strong. You see, when you come out of these toxic relationships, they can have life-lasting impacts on you. And yet, even near certain death, Samson, blinded, scarred, calls out to God and says, "Remember me. Strengthen me once more. So the Philistines have Samson in prison, and then they bring him out and they begin to parade him in the temple of their foreign god. They begin to parade him around and make a fool out of him once more. And so when the Philistines stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support this temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were 3,000 men, and Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood, bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left on the other. Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than when he lived. Our God is a God of second chances. He's a God of third chances. He's a God of fourth chances. Samson has made all of these mistakes in his life. He's gotten into this toxic relationship. He's been used, chewed up, and spit out by Delilah. And yet he, in that moment, even though the power of God had left Samson, God was still right there. And so when Samson cries out, he says, "Remember me, God, strengthen me. Use me despite my past. Use me once more for your victory." You see, when we come out of these tragic relationships in our life, the toxic ones, we will see signs of hope. Samson's head was shaved, but his hair begins to grow back. Even when we come out of the worst possible circumstances in life, there we see signs of God and His hope. The second, the third, the fourth, the fifth chance that He offers us, the sixth, the seventh, the eighth chance, the ninth, and the 10th. I once heard a preacher ask his congregation, "Shout out when I get to your number." What's yours? Does this story sound familiar? Samson, flawed, but he was a man of God who loved someone and was betrayed for some pieces of silver. Samson was beaten, flogged, but with his arms outstretched, he conquered his enemy. Amen. Gracious God, we give you thanks for pursuing us over and over and over again in our lives. Lord, we give you thanks that despite our failures, despite our flaws, Lord, you call us out of the toxic relationships. When we emerge on the other side, God, you are right there beside us, loving us, strengthening us, using us once again for your glory. So we lift this up to you in Jesus' name. Amen. Let's go ahead and stand.